The air in the briefing tent at Forward Operating Base Vigilance was a thick cocktail of dust, stale coffee, and nervous sweat. It clung to the canvas walls and settled on the shoulders of the assembled officers, a tangible film of anxiety. Outside, the Zarkin wind howled a low, mournful dirge across the rock-strewn valley, a constant reminder of their isolation. Captain Eva Rostova stood in the back, motionless, a ghost in a standard-issue ACU pattern that seemed to swallow the light around her. She was a study in stillness, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, her gaze fixed not on the front of the tent where a 3-star general was about to appear, but on the flickering screen of the mil-spec datapad she held. A murmur rippled through the officers as the tent flap was thrown open with theatrical force. General Marcus Thorne entered as if he were breaching a door, his presence a physical force that sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. He was a bull of a man, his chest a billboard of combat ribbons and commendations, his jaw set in a permanent expression of aggressive authority. He moved with the rolling gait of a man who had spent a lifetime kicking down obstacles, both literal and bureaucratic. Behind him, a step to the right, trailed Major Kalen Vance, Thorne's aide-de-camp, his face a mask of polished ambition and reflected glory. "All right, settle down," Thorne's voice boomed, a gravelly sound honed by years of shouting over engine roar and artillery fire. He didn't need a microphone. The room snapped to attention. "I'm here to make sure Vigilance is ready to bite when the time comes. Reports from Langley say the local troublemakers are feeling bold. I want to see teeth, not paperwork." His eyes, sharp and dismissive, swept the room. They passed over Rostova without a flicker of recognition, lumping her in with the background, the support staff, the necessary but unglamorous cogs in the machine. He launched into a speech about combat readiness, about the warrior spirit, about the unassailable lethality of the American soldier. He spoke of bayonets and kill zones, of fire and maneuver. Rostova's thumb moved on her datapad, scrolling past logistics manifests, personnel rosters, and ammunition counts. Her focus was absolute, a pinpoint of concentration in the storm of the general's rhetoric. A single line item, buried deep within a submenu for POL, petroleum, oils, and lubricants, was flagged with a persistent, pulsing red alert. It was an anomaly in the specific gravity readings for the high-altitude turbine fuel delivered to the FOB's most critical outpost, OP Griffin, perched on the highest ridge overlooking the pass. It was a tiny discrepancy, a fractional deviation that 99 out of 100 quartermasters would have dismissed as a sensor calibration error. "We are the tip of the spear," Thorne declared, slamming a meaty fist on the briefing table for emphasis. The coffee mugs jumped. "And it's my job to make sure that spear is sharp. That means our trigger pullers on the line have everything they need. And it means the support elements." He paused, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk touching his lips. "Make sure the coffee is hot and the beans and bullets are counted." A few sycophantic chuckles echoed from the front row. Major Vance's was the loudest. Rostova's expression remained unchanged. Her eyes were still locked on the blinking red line. The discrepancy wasn't a calibration error. She had cross-referenced it with the atmospheric pressure logs from the time of delivery and the fuel transport's own internal sensor data. The numbers were wrong. They were fundamentally, dangerously wrong. The fuel was compromised. She looked up from the datapad for the first time, her gaze sweeping past the general and his aide. She looked at the faces of the infantry and special forces officers in the room, men whose lives depended on the flawless execution of 1,000 unseen logistical details. They were listening to the general talk about being a spear, unaware that its very tip was being deliberately, methodically blunted. The wind howled louder, a promise of the storm the forecasters had predicted but whose ferocity they had dangerously underestimated. Eva Rostova said nothing. She simply watched, and she waited for the general to finish talking about a war he thought he understood, while she was already fighting a different one he couldn't even see. The blinking red light on her screen was not a data point. It was the quiet tick of a bomb. The briefing concluded, and the officers dispersed, their conversations a low hum of tactical jargon and forced confidence. General Thorne held court at the front, regaling a small circle of senior staff with a war story. Major Vance stood nearby, acting as a gatekeeper, his posture radiating self-importance. Rostova navigated the thinning crowd with an economy of movement that was nearly invisible, her objective the general's inner circle. She stopped a respectable distance from Major Vance, waiting for a break in the conversation. Her patience was a deep well. When Vance finally turned, his eyes flicked over her captain's bars with a dismissive glance, his smile tight and condescending. "Captain, can I help you?" His tone implied she was an interruption, a piece of administrative trivia. "Major, I need a moment with the general," Rostova said, her voice even and low, devoid of deference but equally lacking in challenge. It was a simple statement of fact. Vance's smile didn't waver. "The general is on a tight schedule, Captain. He's reviewing combat readiness, not supply requisitions. Whatever it is, put it in a report. I'll make sure it gets into the proper channels." The pause was deliberate, a small, petty assertion of his power over her place in the hierarchy. "This can't wait for a report, Major," Rostova stated, her gaze unwavering. She held up the datapad. "There's a critical issue with the JP-8 fuel reserves at OP Griffin. The integrity of the supply is compromised. It requires the general's immediate attention." Vance scoffed, a soft, airy sound of disbelief. "Captain, do you have any idea what's on the general's plate right now? We have credible intelligence of an imminent enemy push. He's concerned with troop positions and fields of fire, not the specific gravity of your jet fuel. Is the generator at Griffin running?" "For now," she replied. "But the fuel is contaminated. When the temperature drops, it will gel. The filtration systems will clog, and the turbine will fail. The backup generator runs on the same reserve tank." Vance waved a flippant hand. "Then the engineers will fix it. That's what they're for. This is a combat command, Captain, not a Jiffy Lube. Now, if you'll excuse me." Major Vance Thorne's voice cut through the air like a razor. The circle of officers around him fell silent. He had overheard the last part of the exchange and was striding toward them, his expression thunderous. "Is there a problem here?" "No, sir," Vance said, snapping to a rigid posture. "Captain Rostova was just raising a minor logistical concern. I was handling it." Thorne's glare settled on Rostova. It was like being pinned by a physical weight. "You're the quartermaster?" he demanded, though it wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I just spent 30 minutes talking about sharpening the spear, and you're wasting my aide's time with fuel additives? What is the problem, Captain?" Rostova met his gaze without flinching. "General, the fuel delivered to OP Griffin is off-spec. Severely. My analysis suggests it contains a high concentration of an unknown paraffinic agent. With the incoming storm and the projected temperature drop, it poses an immediate and catastrophic failure risk to the outpost's power generation." Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working silently. The silence stretched, thick with hostility. He glanced at the other officers, who were watching with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Finally, he laughed. It was not a sound of humor. It was a harsh, barking noise of utter contempt. "A catastrophic failure risk?" he mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Captain, I have a company of Green Berets on that ridge, men who eat catastrophic risks for breakfast. Their job is to hold that pass. Your job is to make sure they have what they need to do it. Are you telling me you failed at that job?" "No, General," she said calmly. "I'm telling you the equipment you've provided them with is about to fail because of sabotage, not neglect. This fuel was deliberately contaminated." The word sabotage hung in the air, an electric charge. Thorne's face darkened, the mockery vanishing, replaced by cold fury. "That is a serious accusation, Captain. You'd better have more than a feeling from your little computer screen." "I have data, sir. Cross-correlated sensor logs from 3 independent sources. The deviation is mathematically certain. I deal in facts on the ground, not mathematical certainties." Thorne roared, jabbing a finger toward the tent flap and the mountains beyond. The fact is that outpost is the linchpin of my entire defensive posture. You come into my command tent, on the eve of a potential enemy offensive, and you try to scare me with ghost stories about bad gas? You're either incompetent or you're a fearmonger. Which is it? Rostova stood her ground, a rock in the torrent of his anger. I am neither, sir. I am a logistics officer reporting a critical vulnerability in your operational readiness. Get out, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Get out of my command tent. Go back to your containers and count your damn beans. If a generator fails, I'll hold you personally responsible for not having the parts on hand to fix it. But do not ever again question the integrity of my command with this kind of unsubstantiated nonsense. Is that clear? Yes, General, Rostova said. There was no emotion in her voice. She gave a crisp, correct nod, turned, and walked out of the tent, the weight of every dismissive stare following her. Outside, the wind tore at her uniform, whipping sand and grit into the air. The sky to the north was no longer just gray. It was a bruised, menacing purple. The storm was coming, and with it the failure she had predicted. General Thorne had given her an order, but he hadn't understood the authority she truly carried, or the real nature of the orders she followed. The first sign of the crisis was not a bang, but a flicker. On the main tactical display in the FOB's command center, the icon for OP Griffin blinked once, then twice before turning a sickly amber. The data feed from its long-range thermal imagers and ground-penetrating radar went static. A comms technician, a young specialist with wide, nervous eyes, turned to the officer of the watch. Sir, I've lost the primary sensor feed from Griffin. General Thorne, who had been poring over topographical maps with his intelligence chief, looked up. Get them on the horn. Find out what's going on. The attempt was futile. The storm, which had descended from the peaks with the speed and fury of an avalanche, had become a blizzard of historic proportions. It was a solid wall of white, a screaming vortex of wind and ice that smothered radio waves and blinded satellites. The intermittent squawks from the comms channel were unintelligible, buried under a roar of static. Backup comms, Thorne barked. Switch to laser comms. No line of sight, sir, the technician replied, his voice strained. The particulates in the air are too dense. It's like trying to shine a laser through a concrete wall. Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into the command tent. OP Griffin was their eyes and ears. Without it, they were blind to the valley, to the pass, to the enemy they knew was gathering in the storm's shadow. Then the second icon blinked out. The amber light signifying a system's fault turned to a stark, blood red. The outpost's automated defense grid, the remote turrets, the electronic countermeasures had gone offline. What the hell is happening up there? Major Vance demanded, his voice a pitch higher than usual. A frantic, garbled voice suddenly broke through the static for a single, horrifying second. Main gen is down. Fuel lines frozen solid. Trying backup? It's sputtering. Same goddamn problem. We're going dark and cold. The transmission dissolved into a final, agonizing squeal. Silence descended on the command center. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the howl of the wind against the tent's fabric. Every officer in the room knew exactly what that meant. No power, no heat. In a blizzard where the wind chill was plummeting to 50 below zero, OP Griffin was not just a blind outpost. It was a tomb. The sophisticated electronics would die. The soldiers would follow. Thorne's face was a granite mask of fury and disbelief. He slammed his fist on the console. She said it. The goddamn quartermaster. She said the fuel would gel. He spun on his heel, his eyes scanning the room as if he could will a solution into existence. Get me a sit rep. What's the status of the reserve tanks here at the FOB? An engineer officer, pale-faced, quickly brought up a schematic on a side screen. Sir, our main reserves are temperature stabilized in subterranean tanks. They're fine. But Griffin's tank is a forward-deployed tactical bladder. It's exposed. If the fuel was contaminated like the captain said, He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. "Get a maintenance team ready," Thorne commanded, his voice tight with controlled rage. "We need to get a new fuel pump and a heating element up there now." The FOB's operations officer, a seasoned major named Chan, shook his head grimly. "Sir, nothing can fly in this. The wind shear would tear a helicopter apart. And the ground route, the pass is already buried under 10 feet of snow. The plows can't even get out of the motor pool, let alone clear a path up that mountain trail." The reality of their situation settled over them like a shroud. OP Griffin was completely cut off. The men up there were alone, freezing and blind, just as the enemy was making its move. The general's spear was not only blunted, its tip had been snapped clean off. Major Vance, his face ashen, stared at the red icon on the map. "She knew," he whispered, the words barely audible. "How could she have known?" Thorne didn't answer. He was staring at the same map, at the impossible terrain between the FOB and the dying outpost. He had dismissed her. He had laughed at her warning. He had berated her for wasting his time with minor logistical concerns. Now, those minor concerns had metastasized into a full-blown catastrophe that threatened to cost him the entire valley, and more importantly, the lives of the men he had sworn to protect. The general, who had built a career on decisive action, was paralyzed. The storm and a few barrels of bad fuel had done what no enemy ever could. They had rendered him helpless. While chaos reigned in the command tent, Captain Eva Rostova moved with the serene purpose of a storm's eye. She hadn't waited for the confirmation of disaster. The moment the first amber light had flickered on the public TAC map display in the logistics hub, she was already in motion. She didn't run. Her pace was brisk, efficient, wasting no energy. She bypassed her own office, heading straight for the main motor pool. The vast, hangar-like structure was a cacophony of shouting men and whining engines as crews made futile attempts to start the heavy snowplows. The wind hammered against the corrugated steel walls, making the entire building groan. Rostova ignored the chaos, her eyes scanning the rows of vehicles. She found who she was looking for under a hulking MRAP, his boots sticking out. Sergeant First Class Elias Vance, the younger brother of the general's aide, was the FOB's senior mechanic. Unlike his polished, ambitious brother, Eli was covered in grease. His knuckles were scarred, and his face was etched with the quiet competence of a man who understood machines better than people. "Sergeant Vance." Rostova's voice cut cleanly through the noise. Eli slid out from under the vehicle, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag. He recognized her from the periphery of the base, the quiet logistics captain. "Ma'am, not a good time. Everything with a diesel engine is refusing to turn over in this cold." "I don't need a diesel," she said. "I need the Lynx, the light all-terrain vehicle. The one you and your team modified for high-altitude reconnaissance." Eli frowned, standing up. The Lynx was a prototype, a stripped-down, wide-track vehicle with a specialized multi-fuel turbine engine. It was notoriously temperamental but incredibly capable in rough terrain. "The Lynx? Ma'am, nobody touches that thing but my team. It's a hangar queen. Finicky as all hell. Is it operational?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Technically," he admitted, intrigued despite himself. "But where could you possibly be going in this weather that requires the Lynx?" "OP Griffin," she said simply. Eli stared at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's a suicide run. The trail is gone. There are crevasses up there hidden by the snow. That vehicle will end up at the bottom of a ravine." Rostova met his gaze. "The men at Griffin are out of power and heat. Their fuel is gelled. They are dying. The Lynx is the only vehicle on this base with the power-to-weight ratio and the track width to have even a chance of making it. Now, is it fueled and ready, or not?" Something in her eyes, a complete lack of fear, a chilling certainty, made Eli pause. This wasn't the timid quartermaster he'd imagined. This was something else entirely. He saw the same methodical focus in her that he saw in the best EOD techs before they walked toward a bomb. "It's ready," he said slowly. But you'll never be able to handle it. The torque is insane. It'll throw you right off the trail. Get your cold weather gear, Rostova ordered, turning away. You're coming with me. You know the machine. Before Eli could protest, she was already moving toward the logistics sector. He watched her go, a strange mix of disbelief and budding respect dawning on him. He grabbed his parka. Rostova strode into the secure storage area of the logistics depot, a section most of the base personnel didn't even know existed. It was a wire cage, access to which was controlled by a keypad and a biometric scanner. The logistics NCO on duty started to rise, ready to tell her it was a restricted area, but she was already tapping a long, complex code into the keypad. She placed her thumb on the scanner. The light flashed from red to green, and the heavy lock clicked open. The NCO stared, dumbfounded. Not even the base commander had access to that cage. Inside, Rostova moved with practiced familiarity. She didn't search. She retrieved. She pulled 2 advanced cold-weather survival suits, the kind issued only to Tier 1 operators. She grabbed climbing harnesses, ice axes, and a spool of high-tensile, lightweight rope. From a locked Pelican case, she took a portable diagnostic toolkit of a type Eli had never seen before. Finally, from a refrigerated container marked with biohazard warnings, she removed a small, insulated metal box containing a set of cylindrical objects. They looked like oversized spark plugs, but they hummed with a faint internal energy. Thermal regulators. Self-heating, designed to function in a vacuum or a deep freeze. By the time she returned to the motor pool, dragging 2 heavy duffels, Eli was waiting by the links, his own gear packed. He had topped off the fuel, a special blend he kept aside just for its turbine, and the engine was whining with a high-pitched keen. He looked at the gear she'd brought. "Ma'am, what is all this? That's not standard issue. We may have to abandon the vehicle," she said, her breath fogging in the frigid air of the hangar. She tossed him one of the survival suits. "Put this on. It has its own heating element." As he pulled on the suit, feeling an immediate warmth spread through his limbs, he watched her load the gear onto the links with an expert's efficiency, securing every strap and buckle for a rough ride. She moved like an infantryman prepping for a mission, not a logistics officer. Every action was precise, economical, and imbued with an unspoken urgency. She climbed into the driver's seat and her hands moved over the complex controls, her fingers dancing across switches and buttons. The turbine's whine deepened, the pitch changing from a scream to a growl. "Get in, Sergeant," she said, her eyes already focused on the massive hangar door, which was straining against the force of the blizzard outside. "And buckle up. I lead. You navigate and watch R6. Understood." Eli climbed in, securing the 5-point harness. The skepticism had evaporated, replaced by a grim sense of purpose and a profound curiosity. He had no idea who this woman really was, but she was the only person on the entire base who was not panicking, who was not paralyzed. She was acting. "Understood, ma'am," he said, his voice firm. She gave a curt nod. "Tell them to open the door." As the massive steel door groaned open, a wall of pure white fury blasted into the hangar. It was like staring into the abyss. Rostova didn't hesitate. She jammed the throttle forward, and with a roar that drowned out the storm, the Lynx shot out into the maelstrom. The journey was a descent into a special kind of hell, a monochromatic world of blinding white and howling gray. The Lynx, under Rostova's command, became less a vehicle and more a living thing, a mountain cat clawing its way up the treacherous spine of the ridge. The wind slammed into them with the force of a physical blow, trying to peel them from the mountainside. Snow, as fine and sharp as sand, blasted against the armored glass of the cockpit, the wipers fighting a losing battle. Eli Vance, a man who had driven everything from tanks to dirt bikes in 2 different war zones, found himself gripping the grab handle until his knuckles were white. He had been right about the Lynx's torque. It was a beast, but Rostova handled it with a preternatural skill he couldn't comprehend. She wasn't just driving. She was feeling the mountain through the machine. Her inputs on the throttle and steering were minute, anticipatory. She seemed to know when the track was about to slip a fraction of a second before it happened, correcting with a delicate touch that belied the brute force of the engine. "Left track losing purchase," he shouted over the engine's scream, his eyes glued to the torque distribution monitor. "Big drop-off to our right, maybe 20 feet out." "I see it." Rostova's voice was unervingly calm. She didn't mean she saw it with her eyes. Nothing was visible beyond a few feet of swirling snow. She meant she felt it in the subtle tilt of the chassis, the change in vibration through the floor. She feathered the power, shifting the vehicle's weight to the inside track, and the Lynx clawed its way back from the invisible precipice. They climbed for what felt like an eternity, the altimeter on the dash slowly ticking upward. The trail, which Eli knew by heart in clear weather, was a complete mystery. They were navigating by a combination of the Lynx's internal GPS, which was struggling to maintain a lock, and Rostova's impossible instincts. Suddenly, the vehicle lurched violently, its nose dipping as the front right track plunged into nothingness. A hidden crevasse. The Lynx tilted to a terrifying 45-degree angle, its engine screaming as the free-spinning track tried to find purchase. They were sliding, gravity pulling them toward the unseen chasm to their right. "We're going over," Eli yelled, bracing for the fall. Rostova didn't panic. In a single, fluid motion, she slammed the differential lock, cut power to the right track, and gave a hard burst of throttle to the left. The Lynx shuddered, groaned, and then, with a tremendous lurch, it pivoted on its inside edge, its nose swinging away from the abyss. The vehicle slammed back down onto solid ground, the impact rattling their teeth. They sat there for a moment, the only sound the high-pitched whine of the turbine and their own ragged breathing. "How did you do that?" Eli asked, his voice shaking slightly. "That was a tank commander's maneuver. A desperation move." "I've had practice," she said, her eyes already scanning the instruments, her focus returning. "The path ahead is impassable. Too many fissures. We go the rest of the way on foot." She powered down the turbine, and the sudden silence was more deafening than the noise. The howl of the wind rushed in to fill the void. They were less than a kilometer from OP Griffin, but it was a vertical kilometer through a hurricane of ice. They donned the rest of their gear in the cramped cockpit, the survival suits already proving their worth against the penetrating cold. Rostova moved with a familiar swiftness, checking every buckle on her harness, coiling the rope, and securing the ice axe to her pack. Eli watched her, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. The way she moved, the gear she had access to, her impossible driving skill, her utter lack of fear. She was no quartermaster. They exited the Lynx into the full, staggering force of the blizzard. The cold was a solid thing, a physical presence that stole the breath from their lungs. They tethered themselves together, Rostova taking the lead. They found shelter from the worst of the wind behind a massive rock outcropping, the granite face offering a temporary reprieve. The snow was waist-deep, and every step was a battle. "We need to rest for 5 minutes," Rostova said, her voice muffled by her balaclava. "Conserve energy. Hydrate." As they huddled together, Eli noticed the case she had pulled from the secure cage. It was a small, black, hardened polymer box, no bigger than a paperback book, clipped securely to the front of her web gear. It was scuffed and worn from use. In the swirling snow and fading light, a small metallic emblem set into its surface caught his eye. It wasn't a unit crest or a rank insignia. It was circular, intricate, and despite its small size, unmistakable. He had seen it on flags, on official documents, on the podiums of the most powerful people on Earth. It was the presidential seal. His mind reeled. He looked from the seal to the woman beside him, who was calmly checking the battery level on the thermal regulators she had brought. The quiet logistics captain. The woman the general had laughed out of his tent. "Captain," Eli began, his voice low and hesitant. What is that?" "That case." Rostova's eyes, visible above her mask, met his. They were cold and hard as the mountain around them. She didn't answer for a long moment, the wind screaming in the silence between them. "It's my authorization," she finally said, the words clipped and final, offering no further explanation. But for Eli it was everything. Authorization. Not from General Thorne, not from CENTCOM, but from an authority that superseded them all. The contaminated fuel wasn't just a problem. It was a threat to national security. And she wasn't here to count supplies. She was a failsafe, a ghost sent to hunt other ghosts. He didn't know the name of her unit, and he knew better than to ask. He just knew he was on a mountain in the middle of a blizzard with a woman who carried the direct authority of the president on her belt. The fuel, Eli said, the realization dawning on him. It wasn't just bad. It was an attack. They wanted Griffin blind so they could move through the pass. Rostova gave a single, sharp nod. They timed it with the storm. They assumed we'd be helpless. They assumed no one would be watching the details. She stood up, pulling her goggles back down. Rest is over. They'll be making their move on the outpost soon, thinking the occupants are freezing to death. We need to be there to welcome them. Eli got to his feet, a new and profound respect solidifying in his gut. He was no longer following a captain. He was following a weapon, and he was grateful to be pointing in the same direction. The final approach to OP Griffin was a brutal vertical climb. The wind was a physical enemy, shoving and pulling at them, trying to rip them from the icy rock face. Rostova moved like a seasoned alpinist, her ice axe swinging with economical precision, finding purchase in nearly invisible cracks in the frozen stone. Eli, a strong and fit soldier, struggled to keep pace, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming in protest. Rostova seemed immune to the cold, to the exhaustion. She was a machine powered by pure will. They crested the final ridge and the outpost came into view, a collection of low, angular structures now half buried in snowdrifts. It was dark, ominously dark. There were no lights, no sounds of generators, nothing but the shriek of the wind. But there was movement. Rostova held up a hand, pulling Eli down behind a snow-covered boulder. She pointed. Through the swirling white, he could just make out several figures, clad in white winter camouflage, moving stealthily toward the main entrance of the command bunker. They moved with the confident gait of predators approaching a crippled animal. There were 6 of them. "They're here to confirm the kill," Rostova whispered, her voice a ghost on the wind. "And to make sure no one survives to report what happened." Eli instinctively reached for the M4 carbine slung across his chest. It was cold, and he knew the action would be stiff. "No." Rostova stopped him, her hand on his arm. "Too loud. They'll scatter. We do this quiet." She unslung her own weapon. It was a standard M4, but he noticed the modifications. A custom stock, a different pistol grip, and a short, thick suppressor threaded onto the barrel. From a pouch on her vest, she produced a sidearm. It was a SIG Sauer, also suppressed. She handed it to him. "You're proficient with this?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Eli said, his surprise growing. "Good. I'll take the 4 on the left. You take the 2 on the right. They're focused on the door. They won't be expecting contact from their rear flank. Wait for my first shot. Use single, precise shots, head or center mass. Don't waste ammunition." Her instructions were delivered with the cold, clipped authority of a Special Forces team leader laying out a plan of attack. There was no room for discussion. Eli nodded, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. Rostova moved out from behind the rock, sinking into the snow, becoming part of the storm. She didn't crawl. She flowed across the ground, a white phantom in the gale. Eli followed her lead, his movements clumsier, louder. He took up a position behind a frozen generator housing, his pistol held in a two-handed grip, the sights trained on the 2 rightmost enemy figures. The enemy team reached the main hatch of the bunker. One of them knelt, planting a breaching charge. They were confident, arrogant. A soft thump hiss cut through the wind, almost swallowed by it. It was the sound of Rostova's suppressed rifle. The enemy soldier planting the charge crumpled silently into the snow, a dark hole appearing in the side of his head. Before his body had even settled, 2 more thump-hiss sounds followed in rapid succession. The 2 men nearest to him dropped without a sound. The remaining 3 spun around, their weapons raised, confusion and panic on their faces. They fired blindly into the blizzard, their unsuppressed rifles cracking loudly against the storm's roar. Eli's training took over. He had his targets. He squeezed the trigger. Fut. The 2 soldiers on the right staggered, clutching at their chests, before collapsing into the snow. The last man standing sprayed a frantic burst of fire in Rostova's direction, the muzzle flashes illuminating the swirling snow. Rostova was no longer there. She materialized to his left, rising from the snow like an apparition. The man turned, his eyes wide with shock. A final thump hiss and he fell backward, his rifle clattering against the icy ground. Silence. It was over in less than 10 seconds. 6 hostiles neutralized with brutal surgical efficiency. Rostova stood over the last man, her rifle held at the low ready, her head scanning the perimeter. She was completely calm, her breathing even. "Clear," she said. "Let's get inside." She worked the electronic lock on the bunker door, overriding it with a device from her toolkit. The heavy door hissed open, revealing a dark, frigid interior. They found the 4-man crew of OP Griffin huddled together in the comms room, wrapped in emergency blankets, their faces pale with hypothermia but alive. Rostova didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Sergeant Vance, get them into the survival suits we brought. I'll handle the generator." She moved to the engineering section, the small metal box with the thermal regulators in her hand. Eli watched her go, his awe now complete. This woman was a warrior, a mechanic, and a ghost, all wrapped in the unassuming package of a logistics captain. An hour later, the lights in OP Griffin flickered back to life. The heaters roared, blasting warm air into the frozen space. The long-range sensors spun up, their icons turning from red to green on the tactical displays. Rostova, using the specialized parts she had brought, had not just thawed the fuel line. She had bypassed the contaminated tank entirely, rigging a direct feed from a small, pure reserve and installing the self-heating thermal regulators to prevent a recurrence. As the systems came online, they painted a chilling picture on the screens. The main enemy force, a column of armored vehicles and infantry, was moving through the pass under the cover of the storm, believing the outpost that watched over it was dead. "Get me the general," Rostova said to the now-revived comms tech. "Use a tight beam encryption. Now!" When the storm finally broke with the dawn, General Thorne's helicopter was the first thing in the air. It landed heavily on the helipad at OP Griffin, its rotors whipping up clouds of fresh snow. Thorne jumped out before the ramp was fully down, Major Vance scrambling to keep up. He expected to find a frozen catastrophe, a recovery mission. Instead, he found the outpost brightly lit and buzzing with activity. The bodies of the 6 enemy commandos were laid out in a neat row near the perimeter, their gear stripped and catalogued. The American soldiers of the outpost crew were warming up, giving after-action reports to a very attentive Sergeant Eli Vance. And in the center of the command bunker, her uniform covered in grime and frozen mud, stood Captain Eva Rostova. She was calmly running a diagnostic on the radar array, a cup of steaming coffee in her hand. She looked up as Thorne entered, her expression neutral. Thorne stopped dead, his mind struggling to process the scene. The dead enemy soldiers, the fully operational command center, the quiet quartermaster who looked like she had just wrestled a mountain and won. What happened here?" Thorne stammered, his voice betraying his shock. Major Vance was speechless, his mouth agape as he stared at the carnage outside and the impossible calm inside. "We had an equipment malfunction, sir," Rostova said, her voice flat. "It's been corrected. We then repelled a hostile probe. OP Griffin is fully operational." Thorne strode toward her, his eyes blazing with 1,000 questions. "Repelled a probe? With who? Who are these men?" He gestured toward the dead commandos. "They were uninvited guests, General." Thorne's eyes fell on the gear laid out on a nearby table. The suppressed weapons, the specialized climbing equipment. and clipped to the front of Rostova's vest, impossible to miss in the bright light of the bunker, was the small, black case. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the small, metallic seal glinting under the lights. He took a step closer, his breath catching in his throat. He was a 3-star general. He had been in rooms where the highest national secrets were discussed. He recognized that seal. It wasn't a badge. It was a key to a level of power and authority that made his 3 stars seem like little more than decoration. He looked from the seal back to her face, seeing her for the first time. He saw the exhaustion she held at bay, the steel in her eyes, the quiet lethality in her posture. The laughter from the briefing tent echoed in his memory, a sour, shameful sound. He demanded, his voice now a low rumble of disbelief and dawning comprehension. "Who in God's name are you, Captain?" Rostova didn't answer. She just took a slow sip of her coffee. It was Eli Vance who spoke, stepping forward. "She's the reason we're all still alive, sir. She's the reason your spear is still sharp." Thorne's gaze shifted from Rostova to Eli, then back. He saw the absolute conviction in the sergeant's eyes. He looked again at the presidential seal on her case. The pieces fell into place with the force of a physical blow. The sabotage, her prescient warning, her impossible solo mission, her combat prowess. She wasn't a quartermaster who had gotten lucky. She was a guardian operating in the shadows, her rank and position a carefully constructed fiction. A wave of cold realization washed over him, colder than the mountain wind. He had not just dismissed an officer. He had impeded a direct instrument of national command authority. He had laughed at her. He straightened his back, the ingrained arrogance of his rank dissolving into something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Profound, unadulterated respect. A salute would have been inappropriate, a breach of the very cover she operated under. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of concession from one warrior to another, albeit one from a world he barely understood. "Captain," he said, his voice quiet and heavy with the weight of his error. "My apologies." Rostova simply returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement. Apology accepted. Now there was work to do. She turned back to her screen. "General, the enemy's main force is located in these grid coordinates. They believe this pass is undefended. I suggest you rectify that assumption." Hours later, the sun cast long, golden rays across the snow-draped peaks of the Zarkin Mountains. The crisis was over. Acting on Rostova's perfect intelligence, Thorne had vectored in 2 flights of A-10 Warthogs. The attack had been a devastating success, catching the enemy armored column in the narrow pass and turning it into a miles-long scrapyard. The offensive was broken before it had ever truly begun. Back at FOB Vigilance, the atmosphere was one of weary relief. In the command center, General Thorne was coordinating the cleanup operations, his voice crisp and authoritative once more, but the blustering arrogance was gone. It had been replaced by a grim, focused intensity. He glanced out the window of the command center, his eyes searching. He found her. Captain Rostova was standing alone beside the helipad, away from the quiet celebrations and the busy debriefs. The Lynx LATV was parked nearby, caked in mud and ice, a monument to its impossible journey. She wasn't resting. She wasn't talking to anyone. She had a small cleaning kit open on a crate and was methodically servicing her sidearm. Thorne watched her, mesmerized by the economy of her movements. The world saw a logistics officer. He now saw something far more complex and dangerous. He saw the silent professional who operated in the seams of the great, grinding machine of war, ensuring it didn't collapse from within. He saw the person who handled the threats that couldn't be put in a briefing slide, the ones that festered in the dark corners of logistics chains and maintenance reports. Her hands moved with a practiced, ritualistic grace. She field-stripped the SIG sour, laying each component out on a clean cloth. The slide, the barrel, the recoil spring, the frame. Each piece was wiped down with a solvent-soaked patch, inspected with an expert's eye, and then carefully lubricated. It was not the cursory cleaning of a soldier fulfilling a duty. It was the intimate, focused ritual of a master craftsman caring for the tools of her trade. It was an act of meditation, of centering herself after the violence and chaos. Thorne turned to Major Kalen Vance, who had been hovering silently at his elbow for the past hour, his face pale and chastened. The Major had witnessed Thorne's apology at OP Griffin, and the entire power dynamic of the command had shifted under his feet. "Kale," Thorne said, his voice low and hard, never taking his eyes off Rostova. "Get me a full audit of every fuel shipment, every POL manifest, for this entire theater of operations going back 6 months. I want it on my desk by 0800 tomorrow." "Sir, that's a monumental task," Vance stammered. Thorne finally turned his head, his gaze like ice. "I don't care if you have to recount every single barrel by hand. Do it. And from this moment forward, Captain Rostova gets anything she asks for. Any equipment, any personnel, any intelligence. No questions, no delays, no paperwork. If she asks for the keys to my helicopter, you give them to her. Is that crystal clear?" "Yes, General," Vance said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked past the general at the solitary figure on the flight line. He was finally beginning to understand. Thorne looked back out the window. Rostova finished her work. She reassembled the pistol with the same fluid precision, the components sliding together with practiced familiarity. She seated the magazine with a firm tap and racked the slide, chambering around. The metallic click-clack of the action was sharp and final, a sound that seemed to cut through the cold morning air, a quiet promise of lethal readiness. She holstered the weapon, packed her kit, and stood for a moment, watching the sun rise over the mountains she had conquered. A silent, solitary guardian watching over them all.